In accordance with the plan of operation to attack the USSR, the so-called Barbarossa Plan, the task of Army Group North included the destruction of Soviet troops stationed in the Baltic states, and eventually the capture of Leningrad and Kronstadt. The capture of Leningrad was to be accomplished before the capture of Moscow, which could have achieved militarily important objectives, namely the destruction of the main Soviet naval strongholds on the Baltic Sea, and thus giving its own navy more freedom of action. The seizure of the Soviet war industry in the area, the exclusion of Leningrad as a strategic springboard for a Soviet counter-offensive that could have dealt a serious blow to the flank and rear of the German units advancing on Moscow. And finally, Leningrad was isolated only as a strategic bridgehead, while the other objectives were not achieved. When in September 1941 the German soldiers approached Leningrad within sight distance, and the advanced units were already standing on the outskirts of the city, Hitler ordered to stop further offensive and transfer tank units to the area of Moscow. After that, another unexpected maneuver was made, namely the Volkhov front was created. On the Volkhov, the struggle was conducted from the German side in order to encircle Leningrad, and by blockade to achieve the fall of the city of 1 million people, the Russians strove with all their might to liberate the second capital of the USSR, which bore the name of the founder of Bolshevism, and was the place from which the successful development of this regime began. It was a struggle for lofty goals, but not for deciding the outcome of the war. Heavy defensive battles, accompanied by heavy losses, were fought during 3 harsh winters and 2 summer campaigns. The front on the Volkhov was still strong when the German troops, after great victories and heavy defeats, were forced to retreat westward across the entire strip of the central and southern fronts. Only after many units were withdrawn from the Volkhov front to close gaps in other areas, the weakened and stretched front was broken in January 1944, with the Army Group repeatedly requesting permission from the Stavka to withdraw troops, but Hitler refused. Only thanks to skillful leadership and admirable combat effectiveness of the units managed to avoid encirclement and complete destruction. After leaving the Volkhov area, troops stopped on both sides of Lake Peipsy. Of all the commanders in the area, several outstanding military commanders can be named. In 1941, Army Group North was commanded by Field Marshal General Ritter von Lieb, with Colonel General Busch commanding the 16th Army and Colonel General von Kuchler commanding the 18th Army. In the late summer of 1941, Colonel General Goepner was at the head of the 4th Panzer Group. At the beginning of 1942, the command of the Army Group was taken by Colonel General Kuchler, who later received the rank of Field Marshal, and soon after that all command of the troops in the Volkhov area passed to Colonel General Lindemann, who became from that moment until the departure of troops from the area of the commander and soul of all the units holding the defence between the Volkhov and the Neva. Only in the late summer of 1942, part of the command temporarily took over Field Marshal von Manstein. For 900 days German soldiers, along with the Spanish, Dutch, Flemish, Danes, Norwegians, Latvians and Estonians, fought here against a strong enemy in harsh climatic conditions, overcoming the difficulties of the local landscape. All those who took part in these battles have always remembered what they had to endure. Great sacrifices were made by both the command and the troops. Without claiming any decision from the high command, it was one of the most thankless tasks that could be put before a soldier. The Volkhov front, therefore, was not initially in the public eye, and came to attention only after its soldiers had shown heroism and its commanders had shown outstanding ability. Even the military historical literature of the post-war period has little to say about this front. For all the soldiers of the Northern Front, the word Volkhov brought rather gloomy thoughts. This word meant the area of fighting of a special character, covering the whole territory from the place where this river flows out of Lake Ilmen to the largest lake in Europe, Ladoga, and further along the Neva from Schlisselburg to Leningrad. Former St. Petersburg up to the Gulf of Finland. On the map you can easily outline the boundaries of the Volkhov area. The history of this area begins with the once powerful and famous trading city, which became the centre of trade between the merchants of the German Hanseatic League and their eastern neighbours back in the Middle Ages. There the Volkhov takes its origin, flowing out in a wide stream filled with the waters of 42 rivers flowing into Lake Ilmen, and flows almost strictly to the north. After 200 kilometres it reaches the largest lake in Europe. In general, the Volkhov created a front line from Novgorod, bypassing Chudovo, and onto the Kirish north of the mouth of the Tigoda. With the arc of the Pogostye cauldron, the front line departed from the river stream, and about 12 kilometers east of Schlisselburg reached the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, resembling here its outlines something like a bottleneck. The Neva, one of the most full-flowing rivers of Europe, formed the front line from Schlisselburg to the bend of the river near Otradno. Then this line passed from the mouth of the Tosna, turned in an arc to the south, and through the suburbs of Leningrad reached the Kronstadt Bay near Uritsky, where again bottleneck separated from Leningrad the so-called Oranienbaum cauldron, which was protected by the guns of Kronstadt. This cauldron should have been called a bridgehead with a great right. It was just an unnecessary end of the northern front. Further to the west there was only a weak coastal defence. The rear border of the area ran roughly from Novgorod, at the northern end of Lake Ilmen through Luga, Vlasov to Pogostye Bay in the Gulf of Finland. All this territory, except for the forests west of the Volkhov, was formerly called Ingermanland, which Peter the Great, in his desire to reach the Baltic Sea, took away from the Swedes in the early 18th century and annexed to the Russian Empire. This was also evidenced by the fact that the Izhorians, a people related to the Finnish tribes and practicing a rather Protestant faith, lived here in some places. All this territory, covered mostly by forests and swamps, except for the neighbouring lands near Leningrad, was completely inaccessible for transport and thus unsuitable for combat operations. The railroads approached Leningrad in the form of radial rays from the west from Narva through Yamburg, from the south from Pskov through Luga, from Dino Station through Vyritsa and from Novgorod, from the southeast from Moscow through Chudovo, Luban, Tosno, from the east through Karishi, Pogostye, Mgu, as well as from Tikhvin through Volkhovstroy, Mgu, and finally from the northeast from Murmansk, past Lake Wonega through Volkhovstroy, Mgu. Two junction stations, having found themselves in the hands of German troops, became the target of the Russian offensive MGA to the east and Krasnovardisk to the south of Leningrad. There was another railroad line, which was practically unused and ran westward toward Volkhov from Novgorod, through Chudovo, the station in Tigoda and on to Volkhovstroy. The condition of the roads only to a small extent met the military requirements, and that only in the immediate vicinity of Leningrad and on the hills around Vlasov. Besides, not all railroad lines were paralleled by equivalent roads. In general, the whole area is a typical moraine landscape, which has retained the imprint of the Ice Age, as can be seen from the character of elevation's small, separately located hills, elongated flat slopes with depressions and hollows between them, as well as from the river valleys deeply cut into the landscape. In the vicinity of large rivers, sandy soils had layers of alluvial and shale clay, as a result of which this area with soil hardened by drying but eroded by water became swampy from time to time. Even in case of low precipitation, a slimy and viscous layer of clay was formed on the ground, making it impossible for vehicles to move, after which it was necessary to change the direction of movement and, at the same time, to postpone a certain operation. To ensure supply and movement of equipment, Tot's troops and organization had to build log decks and roads for thousands of kilometers. The terrain was covered everywhere with high bogs and bogs of transitional type, pine, birch, alder and aspen groves, which had no practical forestry application. All these tree plantations formed the basis of life for the troops, supplying them with building material for roads, bunkers and fighting positions, fuel for cooking, heating and disinfestation. From the wood, the soldiers made their own modest furniture for the bunkers, as well as Volkhov batons with carved ornaments. The last expression of love and sympathy was a modest birch cross placed on the graves of fallen comrades. Only a few bogs in the occupied territory had already been used for peat extraction and laying electric lines. Here we should mention the peat bogs between the southern shore of Lake Ladoga and the Sinyavinskaya Hill with workers' villages, Nos. 1 to 8 located there. Next to these bogs there were also power lines stretching through the forests, which played a great role in orientation and combat operations. The villages in these swampy forests were sparse and poor, and the larger settlements were located mostly on one side of the railroad lines and not far from Leningrad. This was the land on which hundreds of thousands of German soldiers lived and worked for 900 days, marched and dug trenches, fought and bled, in the heat of summer with myriads of mosquitoes, in the dampness of long periods of rotting, and in the bitter cold of the Russian winter. During the bright nights of the northern summer months, and the endless dark winter nights, yet they fought here no worse than their comrades on other parts of the Eastern Front. And yet they remained in the shadows, little known, deprived of public attention in Germany and of little interest to the High Command. In most cases, here was not the tension that arises in the troops on the threshold of large-scale operations. Here also did not occur such disasters as in Stalingrad, near Cherkasy, in the Crimea on the Central Front in 1944, or in Romania. If there were any critical situations, the Wehrmacht report said little about it, and then, after the situation normalized, the radio broadcast a final summary, which spoke of the successful completion of the next defensive battles. Waging constant battles, the troops of Army Group North marched about 1,000 kilometers before they found themselves on the Volkhov section behind Luga, having previously broken through the Russian defensive lines near Shimskoye and on the western shore of Lake Ilmen. Army Group used to carry out this operation partially or completely three large battle groups: on the right the 16th Army, in the center the 4th Panzer Group, and on the left the 18th Army. But from the very beginning this strike could not be realized by all forces of the Army Group. The 16th Army, advancing from the right, was forced to turn its right group, the XX Army Corps, and later also the LVI Motorized Corps, south of Lake Ilmen to the east towards the Valdai Hills, in order to maintain contact with Army Group Center. At the same time, its left group with I and XXVII Army Corps and XXXIX Tank Corps was to move northward to Lake Ladoga and northeastward across the Volkhov to Tikhvin. Thus this army was assigned two, if not three completely different tasks, the solution of which in a short period of time was impossible. Only at the beginning of December the command released the 16th Army from some tasks in the area Karishi-Ladoga-Neva. When the first failures began, in January 1942, during the Volkhov breakthrough in the troops arose a serious crisis situation, which required to release the army in general from any tasks of the command north of Lake Ilmen. It already had a lot to do in the area between Army Group Center and Lake Ilmen, as evidenced by such names as Demyansk, Staraya Russa, and Kolm. From this point on, our narrative will no longer concern the 16th Army. The tank group, consisting of XXXI Motorized Corps, L Army Corps, and at first also with LVI Motorized Corps, whose commanders Generals Ringengard, Lindemann and von Manstein, would soon create a special fame for themselves, was to advance through Luga to Leningrad. The task of the main forces of the 18th Army was primarily to destroy the enemy forces in Estonia and the Baltic Islands, so in the beginning the army, only its XXVII Army Corps, could support the left flank of the tank group. Only gradually the 18th Army began to act independently when fighting on the entire Volkhov front. Already, the first actions of the operation in the Volkhov region and near Leningrad failed because of two factors. The first factor was the weakening of the available troops due to the ever-increasing area of fighting on the entire Eastern Front, as a result of which the timely introduction of reserves into the battle was greatly hampered, and sometimes simply absent, so that losses in manpower and equipment during heavy fighting could not be sufficiently replenished. Another factor turned out to be a difference in the goals of the offensive in Hitler and the command of ground forces. Simultaneous offensive in different directions soon led to the fact that powerful cohesive groups of tank and motorized infantry divisions were scattered. In addition, a LVI Motorized Corps Manstein already in mid-August was removed from the Volkhov front and used on the southern flank of the 16th Army. It should also be mentioned here that the difficult road conditions not only in the Volkhov area, but also on the approaches to it led to the fact that the tank and motorized formations had to be broken up and used apart from each other in areas separated from each other by long distances and located on terrain unsuitable for combat operations, which prevented them from performing their respective tasks. On July 10th, Army Group North again began the offensive against Leningrad. The striking force of the offensive wedge was the 4th Tank Group. Its advance northward was to be covered on the right flank by the 16th Army along the Lavati River and between Home and Lake Ilmen. XLI Tank Corps, located on the left, moved along the highway Pskov-Leningrad to Luga and broke through to Zapolya 50 kilometers south of the city. The LVI Motorized Corps was tasked to move northeast through Novgorod in order to block the railroad and the Moscow-Leningrad highway at Chudov. For this purpose, Brandenberger's 8th Panzer Division was to create a bridgehead at Mga, with the support of the 3rd Motorized Division Jana on the left flank, while the right flank remained uncovered, as the SS Division Totenkopf stood at Opochka as a reserve of the tank group. On July 12, the LVI Motorized Corps, with the 8th Panzer Division on the left and the 3rd Motorized Division on the right, began an offensive to the northeast along the line of Soltsi-Maly-Utogosh and faced on both sides of Gorodishche with superior forces of the 27th Soviet Army, as a result of which the corpus was forced to go on the defensive on July 15th, and already on July 18th to retreat several kilometers. Only the approach of infantry divisions of the 16th Army relieved the position of the corps, so from July 23rd to July 25th it was able to go on the offensive on the upper reaches of the Luga River and the city of Luga. Brutal battles began, in which gradually entered parts of the 122nd Infantry Division Maholts, SS Police Division, a regiment of the 285th Security Division, as well as the 269th Infantry Division. Due to unfavorable weather conditions, the attack on Luga to capture the city did not begin until August 10th, while the LVI Motorized Corps was already on the march towards Narva. To the east of the battles for Luga, the I Army Corps was advancing to Novgorod with the 11th, 21st and 96th Infantry Divisions, as well as with the 424th Infantry Regiment of the 126th Infantry Division. On August 15th, and the following days the 21st Infantry Division together with the 424th Infantry Regiment stormed Novgorod, which was engulfed in flames of fires. Soviet counterattacks, conducted with the constant support of tank units, could no longer prevent the successful offensive of both corps. On August 8th, northwest of Luga began the offensive of the 4th Tank Group together with XLI Tank Corps, which led to an undesirable forced delay for 3.5 weeks on the Luga bridgehead at Zabskoye and Poreki. Here the 1st Armoured Division, the 36th Motorized Infantry Division and the 6th Armoured Division, as well as the 1st Infantry Division and a regimental group of the 58th Infantry Division, temporarily subordinated to XXVI I Corps, were advancing northward. All these units, overcoming serious critical situations and suffering heavy losses, reached the Kingisepp-Volosovo railroad line on August 11th and 14. The XXXVII Army Corps was to provide the western flank of the offensive in the Narva area, but this corps, after the withdrawal of the weakened 58th Infantry Division, could not cope with this task alone. Thus, in the course of heavy fighting, Army Group North made a breakthrough in the Volkhov area. During the breakthrough it was greatly supported by the 1st Air Fleet with its VII Air Corps on the right and I Air Corps on the left. Ahead beckoned the long-awaited goal of all the intense fighting and heavy losses, Leningrad. Prospects for a breakthrough to Leningrad were favourable. Unfortunately, on August 15th it was necessary to transfer the 3rd Motorized Division to the 16th Army south of Lake Ilmen, to the decisive left flank of the tank group. The 16th Army moved the I Army Corps from Volkhov to Chudov, where the Moscow-Leningrad Railroad was finally blocked on August 22nd. On the highway west of Volkhov, XXXIX Panzer Corps was advancing together with the 12th Panzer Division, 20th Motorized Division and 122nd Infantry Division, to then turn at Chudov on the road through Luban and to Sno to Leningrad. The XXVII Army Corps, consisting of the 96th and 121st Infantry Divisions, struggled to push forward northward through swampy forests on both sides of the railroads to Dino and Luga, fighting a constant battle against the enemy and the quagmire. The forests were crowded with large and small units of Soviet forces fighting near Luga, in place of the relocated LVI Tank Corps and the 36th Motorized Division. XLI Tank Corps, along with the 1st and 6th Armoured Divisions, now marched westward and by 25th August was moving by road toward the Leningrad fortifications after the central positions near Luga had been broken through from the rear. L Corps followed through Luga, which was taken on August 24th, and XXVII Army Corps of the 18th Army moved from Narva, following the motorized units, fighting constant battles with enemy rearguards, approached the Luga crossing near Yamburg on August 22 and attacked from the southwest the outer defensive ring of the Russians near Leningrad. They were followed by the XXVI Army Corps, which pushed back the enemy forces to the coast in the direction of Oranienbaum, but he failed to fully seize the southern shore of the Gulf of Finland, where the heavy artillery of the island fortress of Kronstadt and the warships that were nearby. They continued to fire, and after they were landed by Luftwaffe planes on the ground Shallow Bay. Now Army Group North, 80 days into the campaign, was facing the outer ring of Leningrad's fortifications. With incredible enthusiasm, the command and troops overcame enemy resistance, difficult weather conditions and bad roads. It seemed that the reward for all the sacrifices made and all the difficult journey was already clearly in front of them. Preparations for an offensive on Leningrad were immediately initiated. While the I Army Corps moved forward to Kurishi and blocked here the railroad through MGA to Leningrad, the 16th Army positioned XXIX Panzer Corps and XXVII Army Corps so that Leningrad was surrounded from the east. On September 8th, the 424th Infantry Regiment, which was part of the 20th Motorized Division, passed through the Sinyavinsky Heights, occupied Schlisselburg and captured the southern shore of Lake Ladoga up to Lipoki. Thereby the frontier was reached, on which it was possible to hold until the middle of January 1943. In these days the famous bottleneck between MGA and Schlisselburg was formed, which could not be stretched eastward through Chernaya. Because of the adjoining Neva, the connection with the land up to Otradnoy for Leningrad was cut off. The Finns regained their former 1939 borders north of Leningrad on the Kalian Isthmus along the line Tariiki-Rotu-Matsaperti. The Finnish government refused to conduct an offensive and cross these borders for military, but above all for political reasons it wanted thereby to show that there were no military objectives for the Finns on this old Russian land. The participation of the Finnish army in the offensive on Leningrad was also beyond its capabilities, but would have been very desirable for the German forces. The breakthrough from the southwest through the ring of fortifications succeeded. On September 11th, soldiers of the 1st Division from East Prussia stormed Krasnoye Selo, the former training ground of the Tsar's Guards. From the east, the 122nd, 96th, and 121st Infantry Divisions of the 16th Army fought with stubbornly defending Russian units in fortified positions near the lower Tosna and Izhora. The latter two bore the brunt of the fighting, captured the water crossing and crossed the road Yam-Izhora-Slutskak. XLI Tank Corps 1st, 6th Tank Divisions and 36th Motorized Division was advancing from the south, and XXXVII Army Corps of the 18th Army with the 1st and 58th Infantry Divisions from the southwest. At the same time, to the west of these compounds, XXVI Army Corps surrounded enemy troops south of Oranienbaum. At the eastern end of the formed bottleneck, XXXIX Tank Corps covered the rear of the offensive east of MGA on the Black River. By September 13th, the advancing units broke through the defensive positions near Krasnogvardisk. September 15th, they captured Pushkin and reached the shore of the bay between Uritsky and Peterhof. Before them opened gilded domes of palaces and cathedrals of former St. Petersburg, smoking chimneys of factories and high-rise cranes of shipyards and port facilities of modern Leningrad. Empty streetcars stood in the streets. Steamships and motor ships sailed to and from Kronstadt. The goal of all their sacrifices and overcome difficulties was in front of them. General Riengard, commander of the tank units, had the same impressive picture before him as he stood at his observation post and considered the future course of the offensive. The Soviet troops were badly battered, workers in factories and shipyards had already been mobilized to fight the enemy. Ready for an immediate offensive, German tank units stood at the ready, waiting for the order for the final assault, which was to be successful. And then, on September 16th, the general was shaken by the order that he and his troops must leave the heights and march south to use the units elsewhere. He immediately called the Chief of Staff of the Army Group, Lieutenant General Brennecke, who was a good friend of his, and explained to him that the situation was as favourable as ever, but they had to give up opportunities that promised clear success. However, the latter replied that the Commander Field Marshal von Lieb had already been informed of this by the Commander of the Ground Forces, Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, and that he was of the same opinion. But the order, despite all objections, came from Hitler himself, and the order is an order, he does not allow delay. Binding his heart, General Reingard gave the order that removed from the front of his tank divisions, which of course could not be immediately replaced by infantry divisions of appropriate strength. The enemy gained a respite which allowed him to regain important lost ground, but not only that, Leningrad was saved, as the future showed. It was a turning point on the northern front, a repetition of the miracle at the Marne. That day of September 16th created such an operational situation, which throughout all the battles in this area for the next 800 days will serve as a basis for assessing the forces of ground forces, Luftwaffe and Navy in the Baltic Sea area, for calculating all casualties in manpower and equipment. The words of Schiller are truly appropriate here, what we have renounced at this hour. Fate will never give us back. What happened? May. How could it happen that it was Hitler, for whom it was very important to capture Leningrad, before taking Moscow in order to have a clear picture of the balance of forces on his northern front, at this crucial moment prevented Field Marshal Ritter von Lieb and General Reingard to carry out this operation? There were not then any reasons of an operational nature, which would have required exactly in these days to use the 4th Tank Group elsewhere at the expense of refusing to take Leningrad. In the estimation of experienced soldiers, the command could have found other ways to achieve success. In the book by B. von Losberg, in the headquarters of the Wehrmacht operational leadership, this issue was discussed in some detail. Hitler unexpectedly refused to capture Leningrad because he was afraid to take direct responsibility for supplying the city's population of millions. As an occupying power, he was obliged to bear this responsibility under international law. As a besieger, he could take the fortified city by force and force it to surrender, and he could completely destroy it with artillery fire and aircraft, since, in his opinion, the city founded by Peter the Great was to disappear from the face of the earth. These plans of Hitler regarding further fighting for Leningrad, which put before the field marshal and his troops, not only from a military point of view inexpedient, but also absolutely unrealizable for the soldiers, led to the fact that such an outstanding military commander as Ritter von Lieb was forced to resign. On September 20th, the offensive on Leningrad was finally stopped, and the siege of the city began. The encirclement line was established, which until January 1944 generally marked the front line, although in some places as a result of persistent fighting recaptured or lost a few hundred or thousand meters. The original goal, the capture of Leningrad, was not achieved either now or later, since because of the water road across Lake Ladoga, it was impossible to take Leningrad by force, and there were no other gaps in the encirclement. The front line began on the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, ran from Schlisselburg along the high eastern shore of the Neva, through a more or less large Russian bridgehead to the mouth of the Tosna southwest of Otradno, thence past Kolpin through Pushkin and Uritskik, which were in German hands, to the Gulf of Finland near the entrance to the port of Leningrad. This section of the front often saw exhausting positional battles fought in trenches, craters and ruins of houses. In calmer times, battle-weary troops could take a break from positional warfare in swampy forests. To the west, near Peterhof, the front line was again moving away from the coast and embraced the peculiarly shaped Oranienbaum cauldron, stretching to the Koper Bay and occupying an area of 1,000 square kilometers. The very name cauldron was a misnomer, as it was a bridgehead that could have both supply and artillery support from Kronstadt. This cauldron chained to itself constantly 3 to 4 German divisions, and in January 1944 became a rather unpleasant springboard that allowed the Russians to break through the German front. The forces to eliminate this bridgehead by offensive were no longer there. The command was forced to accept its existence willy-nilly after the September 25th offensive of the 291st Infantry Division southwest of Peterhof was suspended. The enemy used the resulting respite to reorganize his forces. Between Lake Ladoga and Leningrad stood the 55th and 42nd Armies, in the Oranienbaum cauldron the 8th Army. About 30 divisions, exhausted by the fighting to one degree or another, were pushed back to the area of the Leningrad front. With incredible enthusiasm, the population itself replenished military units, marine brigades were formed from land units of the fleet, and duty units and militia were formed from factory workers and employees who continued to work. The industry of Leningrad produced primarily armaments and ammunition, and tanks practically from the assembly line went to the front. the population was used for the needs of the front. The Soviets formed some divisions of the People's Militia, but they were poorly trained, and these divisions soon suffered heavy losses. In addition, 15 independent artillery and machine gun battalions were also created. For combat operations, partisan detachments numbering 15,000 men, mostly party members and Komsomol members, were formed and sent from Leningrad behind the German encirclement front. To fight possible defensive battles within the city itself, work squads were set up, only to change work tools for weapons when necessary. The Communist Party sent some 70,000 party members and 185,000 Komsomol members to the Red Army. It was intended to use at least 200,000 men and mostly women to organize civil defense, but only 63,000 could be mustered until September 1941. Between 500,000 and 1 million civilians were sent to dig trenches every day, working 12 hours a day. Just because of lack of food and lack of fuel, hundreds of thousands of Leningraders died, first of all in the winter of 1941-42. At the beginning of the blockade, the city received no supplies, so that soon people were barely making ends meet. As a result of the encirclement of Leningrad by German troops, the evacuation of part of the population, whose presence in the city was not required, as well as industrial equipment, was stopped, so that a large number of valuable machine tools and machines were lost. At the end of August 1941, the population of Leningrad was 2.5 million, to which should be added the population of the suburban settlements and villages that had been surrounded, and between 400,000 and 800,000 refugees, so that in all, approximately 3.25 to 3.8 million civilians had to be supplied with many necessities, among whom were approximately 1.2 million children and the disabled, and it was simply impossible to employ them in any kind of work. No exact figures are available on the number of casualties who died as a result of starvation, disease, and shelling of the city, but some estimates range from 0.5 to 1 million. Despite the blockade, the Soviet authorities managed to organize the supply of the city via Lake Ladoga, although in the first winter it was completely insufficient. Until November, partially continued the movement of ships, and at the end of November was organized traffic on the ice route across Lake Ladoga 30 kilometers long, on which moved transport convoys. On the road in the ice bunkers were located security units, traffic regulation, as well as units that monitored the state of the route and repair vehicles. The labor force for cargo transshipment was supplied by the civilian population. While Tikhvin was in the hands of the Germans, a bad overland road 380 kilometers long reached the nearest terminus of the railroad. When the Russians reoccupied Tikhvin, this road became much shorter, until later a railroad track was built adjacent to the lake from the east. The ice road was located outside the range of German artillery fire. German airplanes, it is true, could interfere to some extent with traffic on the road, but not disrupt it completely. During the 5 months of 1941/42, 271,000 tons of food and 90,000 tons of other supplies were transported along the ice route, which were reloaded at Ladoga into railroad cars bound for Leningrad. This icy route was the road of life for Leningrad, allowing not only limited transportation of supplies and evacuation of people to the city, but also operational transfer of troops in both directions. The railroad line built later, which ran parallel to the ice route, was not put into operation. Communication with the city was at its busiest in March 1942 and ceased at the end of April, because of the thaw, but ship traffic could be resumed at the end of May. The air traffic between Leningrad and the regions not occupied by the Germans could not be disrupted, so this mode of transportation also played a major role in supplying the city and transferring necessary personnel. Thus, the encirclement of Leningrad in accordance with the rules of siege warfare was never realized, so the Leningrad front remained a factor that exhausted the forces of German units in the conduct of hostilities against the USSR and remained so until the defeat of German forces at Leningrad in early 1944. Soon after the Soviets realized that the Germans had ceased their offensive, they launched a counter-offensive themselves. Between October 2nd and October 10th, they first attempted to re-establish overland communications at Yuritsk and Peterhof with the Iranian bomb Cauldron. From October 21st to December 22nd, They constantly carried out offensive operations on the Neva, as a result of which the 96th Infantry Division redeployed during this time from Izhora to the Neva. The paratroopers of the 7th Airborne Division urgently delivered by airplanes from the Reich, and the 1st Infantry Division, which pulled up later, suffered heavy losses during many difficult weeks. The cold steadily increased, the snow became deeper, and the units, fighting in defence and counter-offensives, lost large numbers of manpower, except perhaps in the relatively small bridgehead near Dubrovka, for which fierce fighting was constantly being fought. Here the Soviets had no success, except that they succeeded in repulsing a paratrooper attempting to land on the shore of the lake. From November 3rd to November 10th, the Soviets attacked directly in the area of the encirclement ring of Leningrad near Kolpin, but also without much success. At the same time, for the northern group of the 16th Army arose the task, which consisted in combat support of the Leningrad blockade areas in the east and northeast. This is how the Volkhov front came into being. On this front, for about 9 more months, maneuver warfare turned into position warfare and vice versa. After that, the front line was formed here, which, except for minor changes, remained unchanged from the summer of 1942 until January 1944. In mid-October 1941, before the Volkhov front came into motion, the forces in the area were distributed as follows. The border between the 16th and 18th Armies was east of Luga and to Sno to the Neva River near the mouth of the Tosna River. The task assigned to the 16th Army was practically impossible because the army had to perform 3 different tasks fighting south of Lake Ilmen in the direction of the Valdai upland and joining Army Group Center, fighting near the Volkhov and then moving further east, and finally a combat support in the area of the bottleneck in the eastern direction on the Black River and the western direction on the Neva. It was not until December 3rd that the army could be relieved of at least part of the tasks assigned to it. In the first half of October, the 250th Spanish Infantry Division was brought to the combat area of the 16th Army, which was as if a voluntary contribution from Spain as a thank you to Germany for its support during the Spanish Civil War. Here, as in Spain, the fight against Bolshevism meant removing a danger to the Western world. Commanded first by General Munoz and later by General Esteban, the division's infantry and artillery ranks consisted only of Spanish volunteers, replaced by new volunteers from Spain after prolonged fighting. Interaction with the German services was to be provided by German liaison services and interpreters. The Spanish units wore German uniforms with a red coat of arms on the right sleeve. The division was also known as the Blue Division because of the blue shirts under the uniform. This division was formed in July 1941 from the personnel of the Spanish garrisons, after which it was transferred by rail to the North Bavarian training ground Grafenwöhr. Here the division received German uniforms, arms, equipment, and was organized and trained in accordance with the provisions of German military art. Before taking part in the battles on the Volkhov, the division marched over 1,000 kilometers across Russia, and the soldiers got used to life in difficult field conditions. From October 1941 to October 1943, the division units fought selflessly in the Volkhov area, first on the Volkhov itself, and then on important parts of the encirclement line of Leningrad and south of Lake Ladoga. The battles of this division should not be forgotten as long as the battles on the Volkhov are alive in the memory. Soldiers of this division, starting with their division commander and ending with the last combat comrades in arms who returned to their homeland after 10 years of captivity in Russia, even today in their homeland proudly wear German military awards. In mid-October, of the units that were part of the 16th Army, the newly arrived 250th Spanish Volunteer Division and units of the 126th Infantry Division between Novgorod and Chudov stood on the Volkhov. The 21st and 11th Infantry Divisions from East Prussia were about to advance through Kirishi to the north. On the railroad, Kirishi-Pogostye MGA provided combat support for Tomashki's group. The 254th and 227th Infantry Divisions defended the eastern section of the bottleneck. The 424th Infantry Regiment was still standing on Lake Ladoga near Schlisselburg. The Nevsky Front was defended by the 7th Parachute Division, the 1st and 96th Infantry Division. In the Novgorod area were concentrated the 18th and 20th Motorized Infantry Divisions, as well as the 8th and 12th Tank Divisions, pulled up here from various parts of the front. Of the units of the 18th Army, the Leningrad Front, was held from the mouth of the Tosna River in an arc to Yuritsk near the bay by the 122nd and 121st Infantry Divisions, the SS Police Division, and the 269th and 58th Infantry Divisions. Around Luga stood the 285th Guard Division, which provided protection of the rear areas of the army, where in the deep forests were a large number of Soviet soldiers who moved after the summer fighting in partisan units. North of Leningrad stood Finnish divisions along the old 1939 border, but they were not going to cross it. After the offensive on Leningrad was finally stopped, the German command was developing a plan for the fall of the fortified city through a large-scale operation of the 16th Army. For this purpose, all available forces of the Northern Front were placed at the disposal of the army. At the same time, German troops on the entire Eastern Front were carrying out an offensive to the east. Army Group South conducted encirclement battles on the Sea of Azov, advanced in the direction of Rostov-on-Don and captured Donbass. Army Group Center surrounded and destroyed powerful enemy forces from Bryansk to Vyazma, to then move to the decisive blow along the line Tula-Moscow-Kalinin. The southern group of the 16th Army fought to capture the Valdai upland and had to maintain contact with Army Group Center. Everything was going to go to the Volkhov River and to go on the offensive to the east and northeast. The river was to be forced a wide front. The main blow was to strike XXXIX Tank Corps to capture Tikhvin, to then move further north and connect with the Finnish troops standing on the Svia between Lake Onega and Lake Ladoga. I Army Corps was to go down the Volkhov River and, having passed the Volkhovstroy, reach Lake Ladoga. The task of XXV I Army Corps was to cover the southern flank of this operation by advancing eastward across the Volkhov. If this operation had succeeded, Leningrad, having a huge outer ring of encirclement, would have been really cut off from other parts of Russia and thus deprived of any supply, and after food and ammunition supplies ran out, had to capitulate. This was, without doubt, a major operation. These plans, like all operations on the Eastern Front in the late fall and early winter of 1941, were not destined to come to fruition because of two factors. Hitler, who was directly involved in the command of troops on the Eastern Front, which did not correspond to his real knowledge and skills, overestimated the strength of the Wehrmacht. For him, the concept of division was a combat unit with a certain combat potential, regardless of the fact that this or that division could lose 2/3 of its personnel and combat equipment. And the capabilities of the USSR, whose armies stationed in Siberia were freed from fighting in the East through a non-aggression pact with Japan, and whose reserves in manpower were far from exhausted, Hitler underestimated. He was misled by the large losses of the enemy in manpower and combat equipment. In addition, he did not fully understand the importance of the American supply of various materials. The second factor was the early onset of severe winter, which was a great surprise to him, as he believed that before the onset of winter will be able to make an operational decision that will allow him to wait until spring in the eastward pushed frontier, without conducting any major operations. Both factors were so weighty that as a result of severe frost German troops were on the brink of disaster, which was avoided only thanks to the decisive orders of Hitler and the extraordinary resilience of the command and the troops themselves. The terrain where the northern group of the 16th Army was to advance east of the Volkhov and along the river itself was more than unfavourable. Everywhere you go there was forest and swamp, swamp and forest. The only more or less bearable road was the road from Chudov to Tikhvin through Gruzino, and the rest were terrible field and forest roads, which were badly washed out or covered with ice during frosts, no communication along the front, no railroad to supply the troops. With the forces of 2 armoured divisions and 2 motorised divisions, XXXIX Panzer Corps carried out a strike on Tikhvin, which after fierce fighting was taken on November 9th by the 18th Motorised Infantry Division and the 12th Panzer Division, while the other 2 divisions defended the flanks, especially in the southeastern direction. To protect the southern flank, the 126th Infantry Division, together with the incoming reinforcements, had to force the Volkhov River on both sides of the Ural and continue the advance to Malaya Vishera. They managed to cross the river on October 16th, and on October 23rd, as a result of fierce fighting, Malaya Vishera was taken by storm. The city was held until November 20th, until after 4 weeks of brutal winter fighting the division retreated to the Volkhov again. In late November, the 61st Infantry Division was pulled up to Tikhvin, partly by march, partly by air to enable the 12th Armoured Division to carry out maneuver operations. Meanwhile, the enemy had pulled up superior troops to the area. At Tikhvin he carried out an offensive with the forces of 6 divisions against 1 German division, so that the city was almost surrounded. The Soviet troops were pressing harder and harder on the flanks of the Tikhvin wedge, and by this time the real Russian winter, which had come a little earlier this year, had fully come into its rights, and the temperature was lower than usual. As early as November there was 40 deg of frost, and in the following winter months even 50 deg and below. The German soldiers had no experience at all in fighting in such temperatures, and the troops were totally unprepared for such conditions in terms of clothing, equipment, and transportation. As can be seen from Hitler's fall orders, he was firmly convinced that in the winter we'll no longer have to conduct any operations, but only to ensure the protection of conquered territories. In addition to combat losses, German troops lost many soldiers due to frostbite, in addition, at such a frost failure of engines and automatic weapons. All this was a heavy burden on the shoulders of brave German soldiers, and what was happening near Tikhvin was only the beginning. Connect with the Finns on the Sviri failed. On the contrary, on December 9th, Tikhvin was again surrendered. XXI X-Tank Corps fought its way back to the Volkhov to avoid being surrounded and destroyed. For the first time, Army Group North received a tangible retaliatory blow, which did not lead to disaster only thanks to skillful command and incredible resilience of the troops. This was shortly after the southern flank of the Eastern Front had experienced the first retaliatory blow at Rostov-on-Don, and when the Wehrmacht command at Moscow foresaw a crisis of even greater magnitude. The climax of the German offensive on the entire Eastern Front was behind us. Hitler overestimated his capabilities, believing that the Russian losses in manpower and equipment were great enough, and did not heed the warnings of his military advisers. On the Middle Volkhov River, on either side of Chudov, the 126th Infantry Division was conducting an offensive eastward toward Malaya Vishera. In late November, to the north of it, the 215th Infantry Division pulled up near Gladia, where it joined up with the 20th Motorized Division. Both divisions experienced here for the first time the peculiar conduct of winter fighting against the Russians. Harsh winter, long distances, and lack of appropriate winter clothing forced to conduct focal defense in captured settlements. To keep a continuous front was no longer possible. In this connection, platoons, companies, as well as headquarters, wagons and supply units were positioned so as to be ready for a circular defense. The terrain between the strongholds could at best be kept under the crosshairs or controlled by reconnaissance teams. Of course, none of this prevented the enemy from infiltrating in one place or another. The Soviet army was far superior to the German troops in equipment and preparation for winter warfare in deep snow and bitter cold. Fleece-lined winter clothing, felt boots, and fur hats protected Russian soldiers from frostbite. Some infantry units were equipped with ski eyes, which provided them with increased maneuverability. Heavy weapons and supplies were transported on sleds. The engines of vehicles and tanks were not sensitive to low temperatures. The tracks of tanks were wider. All this allowed the Soviet troops to be very mobile in winter, to which the German Wehrmacht came not immediately and only after bitter experience and heavy losses in manpower as a result of frostbite and in equipment, but the necessary maneuverability German troops could not achieve. The higher mobility of the enemy and the superiority of his troops in terms of numbers constantly led to the fact that German troops were often encircled, and strongholds were forced to break through with a fight. In addition, in the fighting used supply units, and the movement of troops was carried out on a caravan system. For this movement, supply vehicles were organized into groups, which were guarded by combat-ready infantry units and, if possible, by individual tanks, especially at the beginning and end of the column. Supply thus became, of course, more laborious and time-consuming, but it was safe. Unusual conduct of combat operations, which had to face the Tikhvin group, soon became the rule in wide areas of the Volkhov front. The troops learned new methods of fighting from the enemy and under the pressure of circumstances. There was nothing of this in the combat manuals and field service manuals of the headquarters. In the entire Volkhov region, the command and troops were not sufficiently supplied with maps. The maps that were available, especially with scales of 1/100,000 and 1/50,000, were simply useless and even misleading, as they were outdated and inaccurate, and often looked like primitive schemes. This deficiency was especially noticeable at strongholds conducting defensive battles. The enemy's map situation was much better, as the Soviets kept their new maps secret. Only in the spring of 1942 did the troops receive usable maps created by cartographers and surveyors of the army and army group based on captured maps and aerial photography. Some units of the 250th Spanish Infantry Division, which was the southernmost unit to protect the flank, forced the Volkhov River eastward and performed admirably, receiving a baptism of fire in the heavy fighting for Pozad, Otensky, and Shevelevo, while the rest of its units defended Novgorod and provided combat support on Lake Ilmen. The fact that the 260th Infantry Regiment lost 560 men in the battles for Posad and Otensky from mid-October to mid-December shows how steadfastly and bravely these volunteers from Spain fought. After the coming frosts made the roads more or less usable and the Volkhov was covered with ice, the 21st and 11th Infantry Divisions of the I Army Corps went on the offensive on both sides of the Volkhov River in a northerly direction in order to break through the Volkhovstroy flanker line to Lake Ladoga. As a result of a parallel offensive across the Black River by parts of the eastern section of the front on the bridgehead bottleneck near Schlisselburg, the Russian troops, standing on the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, were to be destroyed. Here, too, it was sought to link up with Finnish units on the Svir to close the ring around Leningrad, a goal that was never achieved. Both East Prussian divisions had to overcome the stubborn resistance of the enemy in swampy forests, which gradually became passable due to frost, taking positions on fortified defensive lines. Every day the targets of the offensive were, if possible, not yet destroyed settlements, where it was possible to find protection from cold and snow for the night. By November 18th, the I Army Corps had advanced so far that it was possible to take Volkhovstroy, its bridges and streets under corrected artillery fire. Soon, however, the advancing forces weakened because of the increasing enemy resistance. The combat composition was significantly reduced, as well as in all other parts of the front, as fresh replenishment in sufficient numbers did not arrive from Germany. Companies sometimes numbered from 25 to 40 soldiers instead of the prescribed strength of 125 men. The offensive from the side of the Black River also collapsed. Under Volkhovstroy, thus, there was the same winter fighting as east of the Volkhov in the battles for strongholds and supply routes. When in mid-December XXXIX Tank Corps was forced to retreat, and the Russians, constantly pulling up fresh forces from their inexhaustible reserves, reached in some places on the west bank of the Volkhov in its middle reaches, the communications of the I Army Corps were threatened. On December 20th, in accordance with the order, began the retreat of both East Prussian divisions, which dragged on until Christmas. During the battles for Tikhvin and Volkhovstroy, the orders of the command in the Volkhov area finally became more reasonable. The dividing line between the 16th and 18th Armies ran on December 3rd from Babin in a northeasterly direction to the northern outskirts of Tikhvin. The lower reaches of the Volkhov, the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, and the upper reaches of the Neva were now in the hands of the 18th Army. From the 16th Army XXXVII Army Corps with the 250th Spanish Infantry Division, 126th and 215th German Infantry Divisions stood on the banks of the upper and middle Volkhov up to the areas north of Chudov, XXX Tank Corps with the 8th and 12th Tank Divisions, 61st Infantry Division and 20th Motorized Infantry Division was located in the Tikhvin Wedge, with all units were scattered throughout the area. The I Army Corps, consisting of the 21st, 11th and 254th Infantry Divisions, came under the command of the 18th Army, fighting south of the Volkhovstroy MGA Railroad. Soon after that it was attached to the 291st East Prussian Infantry Division, when the Corps in the second half of December was already retreating with battles to the railroad Karashishala, Pogostye MGA. The XXVII Army Corps, consisting of the 223rd and 227th Infantry Divisions deployed to the east, and the 1st and 96th Infantry Divisions on the Neva, deployed to the west, operated in the bottleneck. area, all these units also fought heavy defensive battles, especially on the bridgehead near Dubrovka, where the Russians intended to break the ring of the blockade of Leningrad with the forces of 9 newly arrived divisions. The southern section of the front near Leningrad was defended by the L Army Corps, consisting of the 122nd, 121st Infantry Divisions, SS Pogostye Police Divisions, 269th and 58th Infantry Divisions, where, particularly near Kolpin, strong Russian breakthrough attempts were expected. Oranienbaum bridgehead was surrounded by the 212th, 93rd and 217th Infantry Divisions of the XXVI Army Corps. The 18th Army also received the SS Legion Flanders. On December 19th, all German ground forces experienced a heavy blow. Tense relations between Hitler and the commander of ground forces Field Marshal von Brauchitsch undermined the health of the latter so much that he asked for and received his resignation. Hitler himself took command of the ground forces. At that moment of severe crisis on the entire Eastern Front, with the trust that Hitler then enjoyed in the army and the German people, this could still be perceived as a reasonable decision. A more serious circumstance was that this militarily gifted amateur exercised command of his troops until the end of the war and did not hand it over to any capable general, a professional military man, and there were quite a few such generals. The ground forces had no further unified command that could stand up to Hitler. He himself now performed the functions of statesman, supreme commander-in-chief, commander of the land forces, and occasionally even commander of a group of armies, while from the point of view of reason and capabilities, he could not perform all these functions without compromising the army as a whole. Whenever he could, without a shadow of a doubt, he contacted divisions, regiments and battalions from the Stavka by wire and gave unnecessary orders regarding the conduct of combat operations of these units. In the course of the changes in the command structure of the land forces, there was an important change in the commanders who held senior positions in the Wehrmacht. General Field Marshal Ritter von Lieb left his position, after which he could not find a worthy use for himself. On January 18th, Colonel General von Kuchler took command of Army Group North, and Cavalry General Lindemann became commander of the 18th Army. Heavy for the German command 1941 year was coming to an end. The rumble of battles, which threw the divisions of the Volkhov front to Tikhvin and the lower reaches of the river almost to its confluence with Lake Ladoga, gradually quieted down. The troops were at the original positions where they stood in October. The combat readiness of the units, loss of life, loss of equipment, all this was in vain. The troops were on the verge of exhaustion. Everyone realized that the enemy, having a significant advantage in strength, took the initiative of combat operations in their own hands. Between Lake Ilmen and the Karelian Isthmus stood a fifth of the entire Red Army. In these days did not know only that here, in the Volkhov region, the Russians will never let this initiative out of their hands. As for the successes of the German troops, they were achieved in the last battles in order to prevent dangerous Russian breakthroughs and the return of old positions, and ultimately an attempt to bring the war in the east to a decisive turning point. On the rest of the front, these attempts failed, above all on its southern section. This meant that the command and the troops had resigned themselves to the situation, which was bitterly realized when special reports about the other fronts were broadcast over the radio, and when they also reported powerful Russian counterattacks against which nothing could be done. The front on the Volkhov remained as if in the background, and yet the soldiers selflessly fulfilled their duty. Their life in this harsh winter began at temperatures of 40 deg and 50 deg below zero, and with freezing snow blizzards. At the end of 1941, beginning of 1942, the northern group of the 16th Army, together with 6 divisions, among which were tank and motorized infantry divisions, stood on the Volkhov River from Novgorod to Gruzin, where they held a small bridgehead on the eastern bank and further to the mouth of the Tugoda River. In some places the Russians had bridgeheads on the western bank. The river was covered with ice, and there were no obstacles to crossing it, except that the troops could now pass through many swamps. From the mouth of the Tugoda through its own bridgehead near Kyryshi, along the railroad Kyryshi-Shala-Pogostye, and from there in a northwesterly direction towards Voronov and Gaitolov stood 7 divisions of the 18th Army, mostly in strongholds built with great difficulty. This entire front from Novgorod to Lake Ladoga could not be called solid even due to natural obstacles, favourable terrain and defensive positions. Everywhere there were gaps through which everywhere could seep partisans or Soviet troops in one or another number. For the German troops it meant the enemy is everywhere. Everything had to be fought for supply routes, for rear services in the bitter cold, completely unfamiliar to German soldiers, with a lack of winter clothing, while the enemy was perfectly dressed, accustomed to this climate, and was absolutely unpretentious in terms of food. The Russians had many advantages, but fortunately failed to utilize them for decisive operations. The next 6 divisions of the 18th Army surrounded Leningrad from Shlisselburg along the Neva to Otradnoy, and then in an arc from Krasnoy Bor through Pushkin to Yuritsk. Here the construction of bunkers and fortification of positions advanced much further. 3 divisions held the Oranienbaum bridgehead on the same positions. In the reserve of the army was the 12th Panzer Division, trying to restore the combat capability lost in the battles. But all these positions from Novgorod to Oranienbaum were located where by chance the fighting stopped, where Hitler's order not a step back without my permission paralyzed the front. This order was undoubtedly correct, and was given to save the rickety Eastern Front from disaster. Once the goal was achieved, it should not have become an unchangeable dogma and forbid the middle and high commanders to consciously make responsible decisions. In the Volkhov area the troops suffered from this order as much as on other fronts. In besieged Leningrad, the catastrophic situation had reached its limit. The city really could have perished. And it took all the determination and firmness of the dictatorial system to reckon with neither the life nor death of hundreds of thousands of citizens, women and children. The Soviet troops also had major supply problems, losing 50% of their personnel before spring. Still, the city held on, and the supply situation, which had allowed a daily ration of 5,0012 calories depending on how busy a person was, began to gradually improve after the Russians recaptured Tikhvin, and the overland route from the railroad terminus to the lake was reduced to 180 km. In mid-January it was reduced to 60 km, and in mid-February, due to the connecting branch of the Kirov Railroad to Kobona, it approached the very shore of the lake. The battles, which did not stop even during the Christmas holidays, broke out here and there, then on the Volkhov, then on the Maluk swamps near Shala and Pogostye, so that several battalions had to be withdrawn from the Nevsky front. Nevertheless, the Russian counteroffensive from the east to liberate Leningrad seemed to have lost its former magnitude and was not as threatening. The Russian High Command realized the danger that threatened Leningrad, so it decided to liberate the city at any cost using powerful new forces. The fact that the German Volkhov front forced the Russians to pull up here significant forces was undoubtedly a tangible relief for parts of the army, which were scattered and fought hard on the central sections of the front. The forces that the Russians used during their offensive on the Volkhov could have allowed them to influence the outcome of the battle with German units on the central front. Stalin made the same mistake as Hitler. He wanted to attack simultaneously on all parts of the front, and therefore did not achieve a decisive victory anywhere. Stalin ordered to form a new group of armies from new pulled-up-here parts, the so-called Volkhov Front. The Second Shock Army was squeezed between the 52nd and 52nd and 59th Armies. It consisted of elite troops mobile in winter conditions and specially trained along with 8 rifle divisions. It was also 8 shock brigades of 3 battalions and 1 artillery division each, as well as 10 ski battalions. The rest of the compounds were pulled up later. All these units were opposed by 2 German divisions of the XXXVII Army Corps, weakened by recent fighting. The 126th Division stood on the right flank, the 215th on the left. The purpose of the Soviet offensive was operational in nature. After crossing the Volkhov and the highway connecting Novgorod and Chudovo, the Second Shock Army was to go deep into the forested, swampy areas, where there could no longer be any German resistance, but to advance further north past Luga through Yamburg, and thereby cut off all the 18th Army supply routes, so that then, after the approach of new fresh forces, to destroy it between the Volkhov and the Gulf of Finland, that is, in front of the gates of Leningrad. This whole operation was a harbinger of success, because the Russians knew about the weak forces of the Germans on the Volkhov front, about the small tactical reserves of both German divisions, and the lack of a corresponding reserve in the 18th Army, knew that from other areas where heavy fighting also could not transfer reinforcements. In developing these plans, the Russians did not take into account only one thing: the willingness of the German command to make firm decisions, and, above all, the incredible resilience and combat readiness of German soldiers of all ranks and branches of the army, which could make the impossible possible. The battle, which began on January 13, 1942, after a reconnaissance battle, lasted until June 27, 1942, with the fighting then subsided, then flared up with renewed vigour. Attacks were replaced by counterattacks, crisis situations, suffering and incredible difficulties that the soldiers had to endure laid a heavy burden on the shoulders of the command and troops. This was the Battle of the Volkhov cauldron, also called the Vlasov cauldron after the name of the Russian commander, as General Vlasov was considered a particularly talented army commander. After this battle, he ended up in German captivity, where he felt in his soul a disagreement with the Soviet system and abandoned it. Soon he was leading Russian soldiers ready to fight on the German side against Bolshevism. The capability and skill that he himself, his officers and soldiers possessed was never recognized or properly utilized by Hitler. The fate of General Vlasov and some of his generals who collaborated with him ended tragically in Moscow. They were hanged. No less tragic was also the fate of his officers and soldiers who were handed over to the Soviets in 1945. As a result of the winter battle on the Volkhov, the 18th Army was on the verge of a catastrophe that could be compared to the 6th Army's catastrophe at Stalingrad, especially since the battle for the Pogostye cauldron, formed north of the highway linking Chudovo and Tosno, was included by the Soviet command in its operational plans, coincided in time and thus intensified the crisis situation. From the point of view of operational plans, the battle also had a connection with the Soviet offensive on the completely broken German positions between Lake Ilmen and Orel, that is, in the section of the southern group of the 16th Army and Army Group Center. The merit of the commander of the 18th Army, General Lindemann, as well as its privates, artillerymen, radio operators and chauffeurs of field kitchens, is that both defensive battles ended successfully. Moltke characterized the strategy as a system of balancing a difficult situation. Here, even within small battles, everything was brinkmanship. The shortage of reserves of the army, all the units of which were involved in the battles, already from the very beginning required a corresponding juggling of forces. Naturally, a soldier prefers to fight best in his own unit, which belongs structurally to a particular unit, from a company to a division. In it he feels secure, and this protection is felt with him by his commanders and the soldiers of neighbouring units, as well as by the supply services that provide him, if possible, with everything he needs at any given moment. He knows who he can argue with when things go wrong, and he also knows that everything will be all right again. He knows that everything he does will be understood and approved, and that the field mail will get him a letter here from his homeland, and that he will get the help he needs if he is wounded. The same is true of battalion, regimental, and divisional commanders, who also prefer to command their own units, where they know to whom they are giving orders, know how to evaluate subordinate commanders and subordinate units accordingly, and utilize them properly. Of course, the unified military training of officers and soldiers within the army ensured joint actions of mixed formations, but did not make it the rule. Every day the situation became more and more complicated, which required everyone to take not very pleasant measures. This situation in the troops was nicknamed the cobbler's job of minor repairs. And yet, to overcome all the crisis situations, as well as to save the Volkhov-Leningrad front, except for this work there was no other solution. And here it must be said that the commanders and their staffs showed outstanding abilities and passed this test. Soon the command removed from the areas that were not exposed to enemy attacks individual headquarters, battalions, batteries and companies, threw them into the resulting gaps, formed brigades, battle groups and subgroups, whose personnel changed. There were regimental headquarters that gave orders in the Nevsky section, while their own battalions fought in the Volkhov cauldron, and at Pogostye there were artillery regiments and engineer battalions, whose individual batteries and companies were also dispersed along the entire front. The units of the various divisions were intermingled with each other, and there were combat groups composed of German, Spanish, Flemish, and Latvian battalions. Difficulties in fighting units of different nationalities together included disagreements due to difficult language problems, as well as differences in the character of one or another nation. But even these difficulties and problems were eventually overcome with the goodwill of all. The soldiers of the supply and logistics services were in action day and night, when they had to fight in columns to supply strongholds or to hold a circular defense at their supply depots, and when they went into action with temporary combat formations to patch up gaps in a section of the front. Finance chiefs and gunners also took up arms and proved that they still had powder in their powders. Vacationers and replenishments who were travelling in echelons were taken off the train, formed into improvised units and sent into battle. Marching battalions from the reserve army made up, if necessary, for the losses of units that had been defeated. Soldiers from the guard divisions and rear services, old soldiers who had fought in World War I, went into battle and fought as fiercely as they had then in Flanders or at Verdun. The troops survived the battles in the encirclement on the Volkhov thanks to the very system of juggling. Soldiers and commanders cursed everything in the world, but gritted their teeth and stood to the death. They knew that only through their joint efforts would it be possible to get out of a difficult and dangerous situation they did, and the commander of the 18th Army could rely on his soldiers on the Volkhov and in Pogostye. The losses were especially great among the officers and non-commissioned officers who by their own example encouraged their soldiers in battle. In battalions and companies, commanders were often changed within a few days. Doctors and orderlies were always with the troops and selflessly helped them in all battles. People were not enough, so from the occupation troops in France was brought to the Volkhov area 225th Infantry Division, which changed the mild climate to the harsh Russian winter, which of course entailed frostbite of many soldiers. The forthcoming large-scale offensive was not a surprise to the German command, as this was evidenced by radio interception and aerial reconnaissance services, particularly railroad traffic. The Battle of the Volkhov began in the area of the XXXV III Army Corps location on the inner flanks of the 126th and 215th Infantry Divisions on January 13th, preceded by reconnaissance attacks that were repulsed. After heavy artillery and mortar fire, the superior Russian brigades and divisions rushed across the thick ice of the Volkhov River toward the weak German defence line. Mobile units seeped through the gaps and entrenched themselves in rear positions, after which they attacked command posts and firing positions from the rear and disrupted transportation links to the front. In the following days, the front from the east from Podberezhye to Dimno was torn apart, with individual units still holding on. If each division thought that the enemy would first make a breakthrough in its neighbour's section, this was the usual reasoning, typical of World War I as well. The offensive acted upon the troops like the bursting of a dam, whose released waters swept over the rear areas through torn sections of the front, and in this spill the decisive place was here at the ruptured dam. Strange as it may seem, the outcome of the battle could be decided not in the rear, where there were already advanced enemy units that had advanced into the woodlands of the rear areas, but here on the Volkhov and along the highway between Novgorod and Chudovo. All this was known in Army Group North, where appropriate responses were taken. It was also known to the troops and commanders on the Volkhov, who fought here with special bravery and fortitude for every square metre. Apparently, the Soviet command did not take German resistance seriously enough, but counted on the effectiveness of its strike in the rear, instead of advancing north and south on both sides of the highway. It was very important that the 126th and 215th Infantry Divisions, together with the reinforcements transferred to them, held their positions east of Podberezhye and near Dimno on the Volkhov and reduced the breakthrough area here to 30 kilometres, which made it possible to hold the defence in the area of the highway near Semtitsy and Maly Zamoshi in the south and near Sparskaya Polistya in the north, while the settlements of Myasnoy Bor and Mosky were able to hold out in difficult conditions as strongholds that were surrounded. Here in the end the outcome of the Volkhov battle was to be decided. The narrow section of the Russian breakthrough on the highway complicated their supply, and thus their further advance deep into the German rear. The Soviet troops constantly tried to expand this section by bringing in new forces, but they failed. The 16th Army was now no longer able to use divisions to the north of the breakthrough and to provide them accordingly. The command of Army Group North drew the necessary conclusions from this and on the 22nd ordered to change the boundary lines between the 16th and 18th Armies. The 215th and 61st Infantry Divisions were transferred to the 18th Army, while the 16th Army operated south of the breakthrough area. On January 23rd, General Lindemann took command of the front to Lake Ilmen. Thus command of the entire battle was in one hand. By this time the combat formations were already scattered along the entire front. While after pulling up fresh forces were introduced into the battle in the south of the Spanish, Flemish, Dutch and parts of the 58th Infantry Division, in the north of the 61st and transferred from France 225th Infantry Division, the wedge of the enemy's strike units had advanced by the end of January to the Novgorod-Leningrad Railroad. In February, the Russians managed to extend the territory of the cauldron to Oradezh, where they were opposed by units of the 285th Guard Division. After heavy fighting, the units of this division pushed the Russians back to the northeast from Pristan through Filipovichi, Volkhino and Panchino, and held their strongholds. Russian shock units advanced as far as Kamenka and Lyuban, reached the Chudovo-Yamburg Railroad and crossed it in several places. Parts of the 291st Infantry Division, as well as mixed formations, temporary combat formations, wagons and engineer battalions advanced towards the Russians. The most dangerous was the development of the Russian offensive in the direction of Lyuban, where the highway Tosno-Chudovo, which was used to supply all the troops located north of the breakthrough area up to Karishi, was threatened. If the Russians succeed in making this strike, all these units on the northern wing of the army will die. Here came to meet the Russians Group Endras, parts of the 212th Infantry Division, and other hastily formed units. On February 24th, the Russians were pushed back from the highway so far that the supply could be carried further, and one broken-through group of the enemy was destroyed, and by March 8th, the Russians were pushed back to the railroad Chudovo-Yamburg. The depth of the Russian breakthrough was about 70 kilometers. The Soviet command constantly threw new forces into the battle, rifle divisions and brigades, ski brigades, cavalry divisions, artillery of the reserve of the main command. Commanders and generals were replaced by new ones from whom decisive success was expected. Thus, Lieutenant General Vlasov became commander of the troops located in the territory of the cauldron, the internal front of which was stretched for more than 200 kilometers. And yet the culmination of a dangerous situation for the 18th Army had not yet been reached. Until then, the Soviet command by forces of the 54th Army more and more constrained the German units transferred from the Nevsky front. In the area between Karishi and Lake Ladoga, with the Russians made small and large attacks, and some of their compounds seeped through the thin line of German defences near the railroad Karishi-Shala-Pogostye. All these attacks were repulsed in heavy fighting by units of the 11th, 96th and 269th Divisions. Later, the Soviet command concentrated 12 divisions with 200 T-34 tanks near Shala and Pogostye. The purpose of this maneuver was to break through the German defence line near the railroad and further advance towards Lyubani, in order to then, together with the units on the northern flank of the Volkhov cauldron, conduct a two-way coverage. This was not as serious an operation as the offensive in the direction of Yamburg, but still quite dangerous, because if it was successful should lead to the destruction of the German defences in the entire area from Musky through Dimno, Karishi, and all the way to Pogostye. For this purpose the Soviet command, supposed to carry out the main blow of the Second Army in the area south of Lyuban, and parts of the 52nd and 59th Armies were pulled up to the Volkhov cauldron to cover the flank and rear. Now 14 rifle divisions, 3 cavalry divisions, 7 brigades, 5 artillery regiments, and 1 tank brigade were involved here. The battle for the Pogostyevsky area began on March 9, 1942, and, without subsiding, lasted for 3 weeks. The battle was very heavy, first on the railroad near Pogostye and Shala, then in the depth of the area near the settlements of Konduya, Zinino, Vinyagoluvo, Dubovik and Lipovic. Again, 2 German wings were formed along the railroad embankments, which held firm and narrowed the area of the breakthrough, so that the enemy was not able to find ways of approach and supply in the swampy forest. These were the railroad embankments northwest of Posadnikov Ostrov and west of the Pogostye station. Attempts of the Russians to break the German units here, by advancing from the flanks at Vinyagolov in April, were unsuccessful, because the resistance of the defending, namely the units of the 96th and 223rd Infantry, as well as the 5th Mountain Division, was very stubborn. From mid-April until May, the Russians attempted to capture another section of the Pogostye cauldron in the southeast to thereby cut off the Champagne Cork near Kirishi. Here it was stopped by units of the 11th, 21st, 93rd and 217th Infantry Divisions. The 54th Soviet Army, however, managed to make a breakthrough, but it could not continue to Luban. It seized territory in a swampy forest with an area of about 400 square kilometers, but there were no major settlements, roads or railroads. Thus, despite the loss of territory, it was a success for the German defense in the Pogostye cauldron, which made a decisive contribution to the victory in the Battle of the Volkhov cauldron. Even less success was achieved by the Second Shock Army. All attacks to expand the area of the breakthrough, i.e., to the south towards Pogostye, and to the north in the area of Spasskaya Polnat towards Chudov, in the northern section of the encirclement ring near Krivino, Apraksin Bor, on the railroad Chudova-Yamburg near Krasnaya Gorka, were not successful. Here the Russians were seriously resisted by hastily assembled units of the German group Henneich. The Russian units that broke through were immediately cut off from the main forces and destroyed. In this area fought parts of 61, 81, 96, 212, 215 and 254th Infantry Divisions, 18th and 20th Motorized Divisions, SS Division Polizei and other compounds. Many commanders proved themselves as brave military leaders, but I would like to mention a few names: Colonel Scheidis, who died in April, Colonel Kurtnel Kekling, Colonel Frankowitz, Lieutenant Colonel Goin. The outcome of the battle for the Volkhov cauldron was decided at the highway between Podberezhy and Spasskaya Polistya. It was here that it was possible to cut off the enemy who had broken through from his rear units, and this was understood by both the German command and the troops. Consistent implementation of this plan led to a well-deserved victory. While the battles for the Pogostyevsky district in the north were still in full swing, on March 15th, parts of the I Army Corps went on the offensive, preceded by the SS Division Polizei. The offensive was carried out to the west of Spasskaya Polistya, in the direction of the enemy's supply lines. From the south they were met by units of the XXXVI Army Corps, the 58th Infantry Division together with units of the 126th and 250th Infantry Divisions. After fighting that lasted several days, on March 19th, both shock wedges managed to unite on the notorious Heather Clearing. The ring around the Volkhov cauldron was closed for the first time. The enemy, however, managed to open one more supply route here at the end of March, but it was limited to 3 kilometers on both sides of the Heather sagebrush. Even the construction of 2 field railroads through the gap could no longer supply the 180,000 soldiers in the cauldron. Arm, which ran from Tregobov south to Moskov, was 20 kilometers long, but its width was nowhere more than 3 to 4 kilometers, and for its entire length it was under fire from artillery and heavy infantry weapons of the enemy. In addition, there were constant attacks by strike groups and infiltrated in this section of the Russian units. At the beginning of this arm stood a shield with the inscription, "Here begins the ass of the world." This arm, also called the finger, the Russians tried to destroy with attacks from both sides. It was thawing and thawing time, but that did not stop the Russians. April 29th began the offensive from the east of the 29th Army on a narrow section of the front north of Moskov. 7 regiments and 2 tank brigades were thrown into the battle. At the same time, from the cauldron itself carried out an offensive from the west 4 divisions. A dangerous Russian breakthrough was imminent. The defending German units conducted their counterattacks in the swampy terrain. The arrow on the scales of the battle fluctuated for quite a long time, but the courage and selflessness of the defenders won. On May 13th, the Russian regiments that had broken through were surrounded and completely destroyed, and the old front line of defense was restored. The time for decision had come. The Soviet command made the appropriate conclusions and ordered the withdrawal of troops from the Volkhov cauldron. It withdrew the XI Corps from the northwest corner of the cauldron and cancelled the offensive of the Second Shock Army south of Luban. First heavy artillery and supply units were withdrawn to the rear through gaps in the heath. The command of the 18th Army soon realized that the retreat of the enemy had begun and ordered an offensive in order to destroy, if possible, most of the enemy forces in the cauldron. On May 22nd, German troops on mud and melted snow began to pursue, and on May 30th crossed the site near Ravana, as a result of which the cauldron was narrowed to 20 kilometers. On the same day, the 20th Motorized Division, together with units of the 1st Infantry Division, managed to close the gap in the heath from the north and the 58th Infantry Division from the south and extend a cut-off position 2 kilometers wide and 1.2 kilometers deep across the Soviet lines of communication. With the steadfastness and unpretentiousness of the Russians, as well as taking into account the unfavorable conditions of the terrain, it took 4 weeks of fighting to finally free the cauldron from the Russian troops. Step by step, the German shock units made their way forward from all sides. There were constantly local crises on the cut-off position in the area of the heather sagebrush. Here, parts of 8 compounds from the west, in almost daily fighting by forces of 4 to 6 regiments, tried to achieve a breakthrough, while from the east were to hit the cut-off position parts of the 59th Army. From 7 to 10 regiments were constantly storming the encirclement positions between June 2nd and June 26th. Sometimes it seemed that the breakthrough was about to succeed, sometimes small forces without heavy weapons infiltrated, and eventually the position held out. At the very end of June, the resistance of the 2nd Shock Army, split into several sections, was broken. On June 26th, the battle that had begun on January 13th ended. 6 rifle divisions and 6 brigades were destroyed. 9 other formations were completely or partially defeated. Along with various officers of the command, in the hands of the Germans was General Vlasov. 649 guns, 171 tanks, almost 33,000 prisoners left the Russians in the cauldron, and their total losses here amounted to over 130,000 men. The decisive outcome of the operation was that the attempt to liberate Leningrad failed. The territory that turned out to be occupied by the enemy on the Volkhov was a narrow strip of swampy forests on the west bank of the river and east of the highway on both sides of the Spasskaya Pogostye, which had no important communication routes, but it was nevertheless a bridgehead, which the Soviet command repeatedly strove to create. The next territory that the Russians managed to seize was the Pogostye cauldron, which constantly chained 3 to 4 German divisions, more than the front between Pozadnikov Ostrov and Pogostye could do. This circumstance was unpleasant for the German command, but in the absence of railroads and highways here, this cauldron could not serve as a springboard for the Russians to make a dangerous main strike. On May 22nd, it was possible to eliminate the Russian breakthrough at Lipovik on the eastern edge of the Pogostye cauldron. In the summer, a German offensive was planned and prepared to clear the entire Pogostye cauldron, but it had to be abandoned as more important tasks came to the fore, namely Operation Northern Lights, which meant preparations for an offensive on Leningrad in September. At the end of April, the Russian bridgehead on the Neva River was also cleared as a result of the offensive at Dubrovka. This finally created a solid front, which until January 1944 cut Leningrad off from the outside world and secured the borders of the blockade. The German troops, for half a year of heavy fighting, were also badly battered. From Germany were constantly approaching echelons with new units, replacing losses in manpower. Newly arrived troops were close to the places of enemy deployment, but without replacement, and a respite could be obtained in some quieter area. If a division could at any time remove one of its battalions from the front for rest or retraining, it already meant quite a lot. In most cases, divisions were reluctant to do so, because there was a constant danger that the battalion temporarily withdrawn from combat would later be thrown into some other area where a crisis situation could arise and would already be part of another unit. Long ago, in all divisions, the number of battalions in regiments was reduced from 3 to 2. Missing battalions in many divisions were not formed again, so lack of soldiers even from the replenishment. In addition, Hitler preferred better to create new divisions than in full combat strength to keep the old compounds. The troops were reluctant to accept this solution to the problem and considered it inexpedient, constantly lacked the necessary reserves for replenishment and retraining, which would have been very necessary.